White Cube. The White Cube.
Hello and welcome back to the White Pube podcast. I'm ZM, Zarina Mohammed, and if you don't know, the White Pube is the collective identity of myself and my collaborator, Gabrielle de la Puente. We publish reviews and essays about art, exhibitions, culture at large, whatever takes our fancy on any given Sunday. You can read those essays and texts on thewhitepube.com or .co.uk, or you can listen to us read those here to you. But occasionally, here on the podcast feed, we will make a special little bonus episode where we investigate a topic that's out there in the culture. This episode has kindly been sponsored by Mubi. That's right, Mubi, baby. M-U-B-I, the one, the only, Mubi, to celebrate the release of Dahomey. Directed by Mati Diop, Dahomey is a documentary set in November 2021. It follows 26 royal treasures from the Kingdom of Dahomey that were in a French museum. Were being the key word, because at the beginning of the film, the royal treasures are due to leave Paris and return to their country of origin, the present-day Republic of Benin. The film is, on the face of it, about the stolen objects in Western museums and the contested issue of restitution, but under the bonnet, it's also about appropriation, self-determination. How should these artefacts be received in a country that's reinvented itself in their absence? There's a kind of poetry, magic, or sci-fi ethereality to it all. Mati Diop gives the objects themselves a voice, but there's also a whole bunch of footage of students at the University of Abomey Calavi in Benin debating through the perspectives on what the return of these objects means to them in the present day. And it also won a Golden Bear at the 2024 Berlinale. But it's out on Mubi today if you're listening to this on the 13th of December. We have a special link where you can get 30 days for free. That is mubi.com/thewhitepube. You can watch Dahomey, but also here's my list of things to watch on Mubi over Christmas. You can watch The Substance if, like me, you've still not seen it. You can watch In Camera by Nakash Khalid, La Chimera with that guy from The Crown, Josh O'Connor, and The Worst Person in the World by Joachim Trier. I went to see Dahomey at the BFI for London Film Festival this year. I loved it. I wanted to write about it. I wanted to find out more about restitution and all these objects locked up in British museums, because the royal treasures in Dahomey, they leave Paris, but what would our equivalent here in the UK be? So I have roped in help on Mubi's dime. Thank you, Mubi. I've spoken to Dan Hicks and Sumaya Kasim, two people who are actually experts. So first I spoke to Dan Hicks. Dan is Professor of Contemporary Archaeology at the University of Oxford, curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum and a Fellow of St Cross College, Oxford. You might recognise his name from bookshops because he wrote a book called The Brutish Museums, The Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution, and that was published by Pluto Press in November 2020. But he has also written at length for publications like Art Review, the art newspaper, the TLS, Frieze, the Guardian, everywhere basically, about the restitution of stolen objects, contested public monuments, and the wider conversation about decolonial work in relation to museums. Dan has also got a book coming out next year with Penguin called Every Monument Will Fall, a prehistory of the culture war. And that book is about fallism, which is the pulling down of public monuments and what that all means. Here is my conversation with Dan. Do British museums actually fundamentally have the autonomy to decide what happens with their collection?
So I think in the UK, we have to look at the range of different institutions. I mean, often when we're talking about returning objects, we're talking about the enduring legacies of imperialism that we see in our museums. We think of the British Museum. But of course, our national museums are only one element of this. And, most of the objects that were taken from the continent of Africa in the 19th century or the early part of the last century, are not in London. They're in the non-nationals. So that sort of loose network of the 40 to 50 institutions, which are university museums, they're the museums in the regions and the cities, and so it's the Bristols and the Ipswiches and the Liverpools and Edinburghs and the Belfasts. In terms of the governance, actually all of those institutions are are under very different sort of legal frameworks as compared with our national museums, which is why you've seen so many of the returns happening from the university museums and from the non-nationals over the past, decades, really. So it's important that in this conversation, let's centre the British Museum sort of sometimes, because it's a really important institution and we want it, to be as good as it can be. But let's also remember the regions. And of course, in a lot of cases, these are institutions that, that don't even have curators who are looking after things because of austerity, because of the cuts that have happened in the regions. These are orphaned collections, as people say, and that there isn't even a world culture curator who's sort of looking after them. But ultimately, council taxpayers are having to pay for the warehousing of these objects, some of which would be subject to a demand, but we don't even know what's in the museums often.
See, I am in the London bubble, I will admit. I am when I think of museums, I think of the Nationals in London. I didn't know about that. Can you think of any examples off the top of your nut of regional museums sending things back?
Well, yes, of course. It's been the university museums that have really been leading on this. Edinburgh for years, were leading on the return of ancestral human remains. You've seen Oxford, Cambridge, Manchester, overseeing returns from their collection. So there's a route for doing it now. At an English level, there's also Arts Council England, now have a guidance, for how the process ought to work. But it's really, it's the Birminghams and the Bristols and the Liverpools and Ipswiches which are so important because actually we just don't know what's in those museums. And so a part of the reason you're seeing returns from the university museums is that we understand what's in them, and they're well enough funded in order to actually oversee and to share that information and to oversee the process.
Maybe a slight shift, but how do museum curators and workers generally feel about it? Is it a bit bad vibes? Do they want, which way does the sector trend, if any?
The attitudes have shifted among the people that work in museums as they have into the wider society. And so most museum curators, understand the importance of a museum as being something other than a one-way street, something other than a space that objects go to die, and to be, left alone, not on display. Those people that work in museums understand that, 99.9% of anthropology and archaeology collections aren't actually on display in the first place, and they want to understand the collections, and they want investment in the databases and the transparency, which are the necessary things in order to begin a conversation about sort of restitution and to turn that conversation into action, of course, importantly, because ultimately returning objects has been a central element of our work for, decades, in the very, different sort of cases of the return of Nazi looted art that was taken between 1933 and 1945, or the very different cases of, the return of ancestral human remains. It's actually a normal sort of element of what happens in our national museums and in our regional museums. And of course, internationally, NAGPRA in North America has actually, set up a legal framework for the return of, cultural items and ancestral human remains to Native American communities. And you've got the similar approach in terms of First Nations in Canada, Aboriginal Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. But how come we're not able to return items to the continent of Africa when they're being asked for, cultural objects rather than these other, categories? And that's been the shift, because it's been I think for a lot of people who work in museums, exactly like everyone else, it just hasn't made any sense that we're able to return in some circumstances, but not others. So that's the shift. There's a lot there, and there's a lot of risk as well that we think that there's a single approach. And so a part of the challenge and a part of the maturity of the conversations that are now happening in museums, and as those conversations move into actions and move into procedures and move into ways of working, it's all about understanding, the case by case and the complex sort of nature of returns. It's a demand-led, process. I mean, returning items is about, Number one, the sharing of information of what's in the collection. And then it's about actually returning when asked and making it a sort of situation in which the descendant groups are able to ask in the first place. But it isn't about sending back. It's about giving back when asked. And the way in which those requests are going to come and the histories in which items were taken are really, really varied. And so we need a nuanced, human approach, one that understands the politics of these histories, that understands the risks of enduring colonialisms in the processes of returns and so on. That's why it's such an important issue. And that's why there's a lot of really, new thinking that's happening.
I feel like the British Museum does take up majority of the space in the public imagination when we're talking about restitution.
Yeah.
How does it work for them? Because they have got specific blocks when it comes to government policy in sending things back.
You've got an intergenerational shift in historical consciousness that's happening in the, European and the North American sort of context, one that was understood on the continent of Africa, in India, in indigenous communities around the world, for much, much longer. And actually, it's a sense of sort of learning from arguments that have been put or understandings that have been put in those contexts for so much longer, that there were reasons why these items were taken in the first place, that there was a weaponization of the museum in the 19th century, where it was, a part of the military apparatus for attempts, to use sort of culture and art as things that could be, taken from people in order to remove their culture or to seek to remove their culture, but also to put them on display in the Metropole, in the British Museum or wherever, sort of in order to tell a narrative that these sort of cultures were dead. And so when the Benin bronzes were, taken, in the 1890s, within weeks, they were on display in the British Museum in their Assyrian saloon, alongside items from ancient Egypt or from the Bronze Age of the ancient Near East. And so the message was really obvious. It was we are saying, we in the museum are saying that this culture has been blown back into the Bronze Age. It's now the past. It's there to be appreciated by art lovers and cared for and protected, but actually in the protection and the care underneath that is all of the killing and the loss and the dispossession. So it's really that understanding of those sort of later periods of empire. When we think of colonialism, we often think of settler colonialism alone. The British Museum is a sort of part of empire itself. It's in London, but it's a part of empire because it's a part of the intellectual apparatus. It's a part of the infrastructures of cultural whiteness that are there to try to tell a narrative over cultural supremacy, that's there to justify violence around the world. And that's, I think, it's the recognition that actually that is not what a museum should be about anymore. It shouldn't at the time, but certainly not now. So we're now working with those legacies in the present, and the public and the communities and the stakeholders who love these institutions are also pointing out, look, these are things that are in your institutions still, and they need to be dealt with. Museums were turned into weapons to put forward one vision of the world, which was incredibly, proto-fascist and hard right. That's only one thing that happened in museums, but it's a big one. And it's one that we haven't really dealt with. I mean, remember, when we beat the fascists in 1945, one of the first things that happened in museums was that any of the last remnants of the displays of human remains in natural history museums that told the racist lie that there were different species of human were removed, and the scientists had no issue at all to say this was bad science, this is, wrong, morally wrong, but also actually factually wrong. So of course, all those items are taken, all those ancestors are taken off display, but right next door to the natural history museums, in the museums of sort of culture, where, so many of us would think that we're far more aware of issues of ideology or racism or colonialism, we haven't even started really to dismantle the same displays that were put up for the same reasons, except they were using items of art and culture rather than sort of natural, natural history or science.
Speaking around that, maybe like that government level where policy is at.
Yeah.
For 15 years, the Tories had a specific kind of position on what to do with objects. Can you describe?
Well, a sort of non-position.
Yeah.
It's a non-position. It was an attempt just to kick the can, down the road every single time, wasn't it? I mean, they never actually came out and said, no, we're not going to give anything back. It was just, no, it's too complicated.
What can you tell from Labour's short time in office at the moment about their position?
Yeah, Lisa Nandy has said that the culture war is over. And I really hope that's the case, because the culture war was never a two-sided war about culture. It was a war. It was a war on culture. It was a weaponization of culture that has a history. And that history is one that we see in our museums and we see in the public art in the streets, whether the Confederate statues or Cecil Rhodes at the University of Oxford. We see it in the seminar rooms and the libraries of our disciplines and the universities, so ideas that were formed in the late 19th century as well. And so we're inheriting all those things from this sort of culture war, a long history of violence in relation to culture. And it's, of course, it's time for peace and for reconciliation and, for putting things right. So I do think, I think what's really good is that we don't have a government who want to fight the culture war anymore. And even, I think, within the Conservative Party, I mean, it's an obvious decision for the right now in terms of where they go. Are they going to continue on the, war on culture, or are you going to see a more moderate right that isn't actually attacking our cultural institutions? I mean, just look at the attacks on the National Trust. Look at attacks in the form of the money being sort of taken away from art and culture, but also attacks upon even the rewriting of a label in a museum or the moving of an object from A to B. This idea that a historic building or listed building consent is something that should never happen, or a museum should never alter a display. It's absolutely crazy. I can't imagine any other part of society, if you think about the criminal justice system or healthcare or any other part of, how we live, where there'd be a narrative that if something's hurting people or something's inherited from the past that isn't right in the present, that we sort of have to protect it and keep on doing it. Rather than reform it, rather than see change. So I do think, I'm really optimistic in terms of the fact that it's so obvious that these histories are things that we inherit. Our museums were made in some ways in order to make some of these ideas last. And so, now begins the really, complex work of actually how are you going to take apart these things that are, some elements of which are so hurtful and so much of which is so valuable and important. I mean, we've never needed something like a World Culture Museum more than we do in the present. These are the spaces, where we can see art and culture, ways of living, ways of thinking outside of a Eurocentric lens.
Right. That question of the future feels like, for me, the most exciting bit of this whole consideration, because, I'm an art critic thinking about the art world, but still relatively in the world of museums, kind of feeling like a layman. I can kind of I can see your optimism and I can kind of share it. It doesn't feel like, I don't know, I feel like I've learned lots just from this conversation, because from my perspective, before speaking to you, I was kind of like, if they send everything back, surely there's nothing left in the British Museum other than like some Celtic knives and some like Saxon helmets. That's it. I'm worried, or not worried. I'm not worried at all. I've got questions about what the future of museums could look like with demand for restitution answered. Like, does it open up new avenues of potential? You spoke about the World Culture Museum. That sounds like an interesting framework to work with. But what else is there in terms of futurity?
Yeah, and so absolutely, exactly as you say, returning objects is all about what happens next, right? This isn't going back in time. So the conversations over restitution, we shouldn't see them. Sometimes we're accused of, presentism, that we're interpreting the past in terms of the values of the present, and we shouldn't be, saying that these things were that it was wrong for things to be looted because at the time it was okay, and so just leave it alone. And that's a narrative that's failing. Equally, some people that would say, hey, it's a paradigm shift. We're moving forward in time. We're reinventing museums. It's really positive, and they're all going to be spaces of hope and rehumanization. I also don't buy that either. That that idea that that we're going to fix the museum, we're going to decolonize the museum. I mean, that seems to me like spin. For me, it isn't about the present or where we're going next. It's about the past catching up with the museum. That's what's going on. The past, is there. The museum is, think about it in terms of art. What sort of artwork is a museum? We might think of it as a representational art form. It's there to describe and depict. It's like a photograph or a realistic painting. Or you could see it as a time-based medium, a durational artwork, because it's made to make ideas and things last into the present. And that's how I understand museums. They're, sort of their medium is really time. And so it's history, and so it's memory, and they're memory institutions. So at their best, our world culture museums, either the British Museum or the Manchester Museum or the Pitt Rivers where I work, or any museum, that we might think of around the world that has these items of world culture, actually, if we understand them as institutions that are about memory, then they are the spaces where we can think about the legacies of empire. We can have conversations, but also maybe undo some of the violence in the present and sort of rework how we understand those histories in the present. So a part of the role of our museums, are as sites of conscience, and with sort of living with those histories or reinterpreting them. But also there has to be the work of understanding the risk if you don't dismantle those parts. And that's what my last book was all about, the physical dismantling, that actually restitution, which isn't just returns. It's not this idea that everything has to go back where it originally was. You're going to empty out the museum. You're going to burn down the British Museum. I mean, I'm often accused of, why do you hate the British Museum so much? Why do you hate museums? You work in a museum. Why don't you just, give up your job? I love museums. That's why I'm in this. I've worked at the Pitt Rivers now for 17 years. You don't do that if you don't, love an institution that you work for. But that's the point. You want it to do better. You understand it, and you want, you see, you listen to the communities and the visitors and the audiences who are saying, actually, this is a bit off, or this is really hurtful, or I'm not even going to walk into the building because I know what this museum is. For those reasons, we have to, we can't shy away from those issues and those sorts of criticisms. So it isn't about attacking museums. It's about actually wanting to make them, to bring them into step with our times, and to understand that the past, as I say, is sort of catching up with us, whether we like it or not. The museum curator in part is like a conservator. Our work in part is to keep things the same, as I said earlier. But actually, that shouldn't be. Often there's a mission creep whereby the curator thinks that they're able to stop the world from changing around them. And that's the mistake. That's always the mistake for heritage or museums or any of us that work with the physical remains of the past. We have to understand this as, happening in the present, happening in it's not about history, it's about memory. When we think about a statue, when it isn't about the man who is depicted in the form of Colston, it's about whether we want to remember Edward Colston in Bristol or not. It's about memory, not about a right and wrong about the guy that's there. It's the same for museums. It's about how do we want to weave together ideas of world culture with ideas of the memory of, all human beings and of ourselves in terms of the wider world.
Does
that make sense?
That does make sense. And I think it frames restitution and I think fallism when it comes to like Colston and things like that. Often they're framed as iconoclasm, and you're kind of you're squaring that circle quite well in a nice way, thinking about them as being time-based, as about memory, rather than putting them down just because you got a destructive urge. Just for clarity, can you give us a quick definition of fallism for people who are like listening with no clue?
Yeah, so the fallism movement emerged in the context of the decolonization of the continent of Africa, not least after the Year of Africa in 1960, where there was a recognition in the newly independent states, from Zambia to Zimbabwe to Algeria, that within the landscape of the colonizers, there were images, there were artworks that had been put to use in order to normalize colonial violence, white supremacy of various kinds, and so on. So the removal of those images, which I guess, the obvious examples that people would know would be the falling of Rhodes, of Cecil Rhodes in Cape Town in 2015, or the toppling of Edward Colston in Bristol, in 2020. But remember that actually Rhodes had already fallen in Zambia in 1964 and in Zimbabwe in 1980. So the links in between the decolonial movements in the history of Africa and indeed elsewhere in the world. There are conversations about all the Captain Cooks in Australia and so on, all the Christopher Columbuses in the Caribbean. These are sort of conversations that are happening internationally, but really led in the context of the decolonial. What that means for institutions that are never going to be decolonized, that's about the challenge. But we can certainly learn from those conversations about fallism, from the actions of fallism and the history of fallism, that art can be weaponized, that a statue is something that can hurt people. It can be built in order to hurt people. It can be built in order to put forward an ideology, and not least, it's in the form of art and culture because it's incredibly hard to remove. It's a lot easier to put up an image than to take it down. It's a lot easier, to put an object into a museum than to give it back. And that's the whole point. There's sort of parts of our society which are incredibly hard to change in the first place, but that doesn't mean that they can't change. Of course, they're always sort of changing as we go along.
You briefly mentioned, I think a couple of answers ago, that you were cynical about whether museums can be decolonized. You called it spin. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think we need to be, someone on a Zoom call over lockdown when we were having conversations over the Benin bronzes, and the Benin dialogue group, of course, has been there for 10 years or so, having conversations about the return of the Benin bronzes. And this colleague said to me, colonialism used to be that you tell me that you're superior to me. Colonialism today is that you tell me that we're in a dialogue. And that was used. There were two different perspectives here, and we're just gonna, state our positions and see, and then have a conversation. And the conversation, of course, that's a very, very good way of kind of making sure that nothing ever happens and to kick the can along the road yet again. And it all becomes very complex. And the language that's used by the museum leaders that like this sort of stuff is all about entanglement and complexity. This is our colonial histories are really entangled, we're told. We're told, there's a whole sort of aspect of this that gets into theory, and we're told, the objects have got agency in the museums as well. We need to think about the way that they, rather than actually human beings having agency, rather than actually the communities that are asking for things back who might have agency. No, object agency is really important. We need to think about material culture in these sort of theoretical ways. Let's use the museum as a sort of laboratory. Let's have a research project about it. That's a really great idea. You want these objects back. Okay, I'm going to apply to the AHRC for a collaborative doctoral award, and we can get a PhD student that's going to look into your objects that you might want back, and my approach and my positionality. But I think it goes sort of deeper than that, which is a sort of the fact that the narratives that a lot of your listeners, if they were taught in art school or in anthropology or archaeology, will know well, the idea of being reflexive, that kind of 90s fix of being self-aware, the important work from the feminists of saying, situated knowledges are a part of this. We need to understand how knowledge is situated. But that morphed into a kind of ultimately rather reactionary idea that you state your positionality, you state the privilege that you've got, and then what? It's okay. It's just there.
Right.
I'm going to state my maleness and my whiteness and the privilege that I've got in this institution that I work in. And okay, that's on the table now. And now, we can go back to having the dialogue. I mean, that obviously that isn't that as a fix. Ryan Jobson has called it for anthropology the Boasian fix, after Franz Boas, who was the great early 20th century sort of cultural relativist in anthropology. But that fix of being reflexive simply isn't working in our museums anymore. So we need to do more. We actually need to dismantle the positionalities as well as sort of rather than only sort of pointing them out. So that's why I worry that some of the work, that if you reduce restitution in the Macron way to soft diplomacy, if you reduce it purely to, a good news story. I mean, Soumaya is the person that's really underlined this about, the sorts of, celebratory narratives that can come about when people say, oh yeah, we're going to decolonize, we're going to return objects and so on. It becomes self-serving, and actually it is a very good way, seeing as there are millions of objects in these museums, seeing as 99.9% of the objects aren't on display, the museum can afford to lose some objects here and there while not making the change that those objects sort of show us. So for me as a curator, restitution is the word I use rather than returns, because that has to be about something more than just sort of giving back. It has to be giving something up as well as giving something back.
Then I spoke to Soumaya Kassim, a writer, curator and editor. Soumaya has written fiction and poetry that has appeared in Dardishi Zine, We Love Dardishi Zine, The Good Journal and more. She is the prose editor of Middle Ground magazine, and she is currently working on 2 novels. Mostly I have been dying to speak to Soumaya since 2017, when she published an essay called The Museum Will Not Be Decolonized in Media Diversified. It charted her reflections after working on a co-curated show at a large museum, the problems and wider context of those problems, and it's been pretty widely cited since 2017, so much so that I, lowly humble art critic, read it and absorbed it and thought about how it reflected dynamics between galleries and art workers of colour. In the years since, Soumaya has written an essay called Museums Are Temples of Whiteness, which sets out a framework for the way museums literally construct and uphold our Western understanding of what whiteness actually is and what purpose it serves. I'll link the Media Diversified article in the show notes if you want to have a read yourself. But the second essay I mentioned was published last year in the Routledge Companion to Decolonising Art History. Anyway, here is my conversation with Soumaya. How does decolonisation relate to diversity, inclusion, representation, equality? Are they actually related? Is there an overlap secretly, or are they very separate things?
I think some people may consider them related. I would consider them unrelated. I think one can relate them in the sense that the idea of having a diverse workforce is seen as generally a good thing. We want to see, or rather institutions, and indeed we want to see people, different types of people working in institutions together. In a sense, I think that goal is that goal of multiculturalism is sort of like this. It's sort of like this dream that this nation has, but the actuality of that is sort of debatable. The success of that is debatable. I don't say that because God damn the immigrants or all that. What I mean is that racists make it seem a little bit unrealistic that we can live in a harmoniously. Although we do live harmoniously, I would argue, in this country somewhat. Um, yeah, exactly, somewhat. Um, but I think the problem with that model is that it's sort of an assimilationist model because basically you go into the institution and they're like, we're really happy you're here. We're really happy you're here. You know, I'm imagining myself, so I'm a woman of color and I wear a hijab or whatever. But generally, you constantly face all these roadblocks which are telling you we very much don't actually want you here. And so it sort of becomes a microcosm of Britain because it's like, well, we're really happy you're here. Thank you so much for your great food. And thank you so much for all of your hard work, you know, because obviously I'm imagining a good immigrant here who does those things. Um, I'm saying good with scare quotes. But then in the institution, suddenly, kind of similarly, you sort of are being told, oh, we don't really want you here at all. And indeed, in the case of if we're using the nation, people are literally being sent away despite them being citizens, right? So the idea of it being separate, I think I more agree with because decolonizing is the idea of challenging colonization from the very root of the matter, whereas diversity is much more about including and kind of having people assimilate and be a good citizens. Whereas decolonizing, I think, has this kind of idea of, well, the system itself is deeply broken and we either need to fix or challenge the system or recognize that the system, whether that be the colonial system, the racist system, the white supremacist system, we're actually looking at the framework and asking, well, what system are we entering into to create that diversity, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense because it's like fundamentally, I don't know, we've been like having this conversation since the 60s, the 70s. Since then, like Nazim Khan, the arts that Britain ignores, right? And it's at so many points the institution has kind of twisted and turned to adapt it and like defaulted to a political understanding of like diversity, like Blairite multiculturalism. And you're describing decolonization as like a way of getting a handle on the thing that we want, which isn't the political fallback, but it's like, you know, equity. It's like some sense of like stable ground. And does that describe it?
Interesting you use the word handle. Yes, because we live here together but we live in these deeply unequal circumstances together. And so the idea that we enter the institution and then we are all here in this together, but we're not, are we? Because we're at these different levels, we're at these unequal levels. And so, but then you're being tasked with this grand kind of task of, you know, bringing difference. You're bringing difference. That's your kind of your role. Your goal is to bring difference, and that's the reason why I hugely love Sarah Ahmed's work on institutions. And so when you use that word handle, I was thinking about her because she has this really interesting like way of thinking through furniture and thinking about, you know, the hand. And so I was thinking of handle of a door, and I was like, that's kind of what it is. It's like I'm trying to grasp this handle and I'm trying to open this door. And people are like, please, you know, open this door, open this handle. And it's like, the thing is, this door has a history of never being opened, kind of thing. So it's like I'm like trying to force this door open and let other people in, perhaps, or just let myself in. And everyone else is like, no, this door basically can't be open. So it's like that, and that's how I often think of whiteness as being this door that will forever be shut, and people are being told you can open it, you can diversify this space, but actually that door isn't designed to be open. So that's kind of how I think about it a little bit. Yeah,
I really like speaking in metaphor because often these are like quite abstract concepts, but metaphor is a nice way of like making the abstraction material. And
completely.
Love that. Speaking of handles and doors that cannot be opened, can you describe the ways that colonialism does live on in museums in the present day? I'm aware that galleries and museums have different contexts, but yeah, what is there to undo and destroy with decolonizing in your experience?
So I said earlier that colonization still exists. I mean, you know, when you contacted me about this conversation, I was just like, I felt really overwhelmed because I was thinking so much about like the destruction that's happening in Gaza at the moment, and I was thinking about like what I feel has been a very muted response from cultural industries, the art world, Tate, all of it. I was just thinking about that, And I was thinking so deeply about this idea that on the one hand, artists, culture workers, writers, we are asked to bring ourselves, our radicalism, our histories, all of this, and yet the way it functions is that we go into these spaces and we're asked to perform all of this and do all of this, and then we're asked to shut the door behind us and leave. And then outside in the world, we're told that's now the status quo can remain. And so that basically, I do feel that both in museums and in art galleries, they function in a kind of whitewashing way, basically, is how I would put it, where the radicalism is contained and therefore will not actually spark anything in the real world. I think people make their careers off of that, basically. I think that's what I think anyway. And I see the destruction of human life, and I also see the destruction of architectures, and I see the destruction of art and cultures and nature. And so the question of like how does colonization continue to exist in museums and art galleries? I mean, I do think art galleries and museums are different because museums fundamentally are products of colonialism, as are art galleries, but they do something quite interesting, which is they provide taxonomies of collecting, exhibiting, all of that stuff. They systematize knowledge in a very particular way. As we enter a museum space, they're basically telling us about how the world is ordered. How is the world ordered? The world is ordered in such a way where we have human at the center. And when I say human, what I'm saying actually is white man. And then we have the other humans, the other humans. And then we have, the other races, women, and then we have nature. So museums divide all of these things up, and so we fundamentally live in a world that is deeply divided by these systems of knowledge, and we act and we're told that these things are real. And so our whole world is colored by this way of thinking that we're all divided and we're all that basically there is no unity between people, between nature, between ways of thinking, essentially. When you say like how does it continue, I mean, the thing is, we live in a colonial present day, so the idea of somehow it not continuing in the gallery or not continuing in the museum is kind of like, well, we live in a colonial reality today, so of course it continues within there. I think also I think it's safe to say that also just simply the way the racism and the kind of sexism that happens within just the work that goes on in museum spaces, the kind of experiences that I've heard and have been subject to tells me that, yeah, we still live in a colonial present because racism is an effect of colonialism. So yeah,
that's, do you know, as well, like I'm so glad I'm asking you these questions. I'm so glad you said it. Thank you so much. Good.
No problem.
Because yeah, I mean, I think as well, like within the difference between galleries and museums, so many people are like very quick to point at like, oh, the objects are mislabeled and like the captions are there, and like the way that things are categorized, half of this is in storage. But your answer kind of gets at a wider problem that is maybe more difficult or unwieldy for these institutions to fix, which is because it's their very premise, right? Like
exactly
the entire format that they operate on. You wrote an essay in which you say individuals reproduce institutions. And can you say a little bit more about what that means?
What I mean by that is quite physically, when you have a lanyard around your neck, you also you become the institution to a certain extent. So what I mean by that is your self-preservation is actually tied to the preservation of your institution. Your livelihood is tied to the institution, and I'm not saying that's inherently problematic, but it does become inherently problematic when challenge, conflict comes to the fore. Let's say that someone finds an exhibition problematic in some way. I do think that individuals do go on the defensive, and they feel like they have to protect the institution. They must do that because that's part of your job, basically. Because I don't really believe in complete agency when you start working for an institution. I think that at a certain point, your agency is compromised in some ways. Pointing out racism, pointing out sexism, sexual harassment even, it ends up becoming so much more about the person who's made that complaint, or it becomes about being about what that person has brought to the table. They become that problem, basically. And I hugely think that that is one of the main ways that colonialism continues in our institutions.
Decolonizing is kind of being co-opted. You identify this in one of your essays, like that the institution is kind of taking a grab at it, turning it into subject, turning it into something that it can utilize in its own particular way, according to its own particular logic. So what do we do now? Because the term itself is an action that must be carried out, and it's a process that must be carried out. How do you do the thing despite the institution being difficult to change or self-aware?
There needs to be a kind of balance between self-preservation, right? And at the same time to continue the work, to continue the fight really for a world in which we can all live and see each other as more than more than our value, basically. The idea of protecting what it means to be a human being. And I know I realize that sounds quite strange, but what I mean is I think that a lot of these institutions have this power to kind of create like the idea that the object is more important than the human being, the artwork is more important than the human being. And so a lot of, I think, our work is about making it very clear that that human life is sacred essentially. And so again, I say this with in the back of my mind thinking about Gaza, and I really do, it's really important to remember that. So the work must always continue, whether it happens within the institutional space that is willing to deny a genocide is happening, or does this work happen outside of those walls? And also, it's also very dependent on geographical location, because indigenous conversations around settler colonialism is very different to us living here in the UK. So here in the UK, we have this really interesting situation. You have people from all over the world here. And so that kind of opens this door of like, what does decolonizing even mean? And can all of our stories fit in? Can all of us fit into? No, but that's what's so kind of special in a way, right? That's a good thing. I wouldn't want all of our stories I wouldn't want all of us to be in there, because and why would I want that? Because our very uncontainability, our very like very fact of all of the possibilities that we are, all of our multiplicity should not fit in an institution, if that makes sense. So I believe these kinds of that idea of like decolonizing, it is something that is happening in the same time that colonization is happening. But can decolonization happen within an institution? I don't think it can. No. Are people decolonizing in the real world? Yes, they are, because they're fighting for their lives, and that's what I think decolonizing is.
Can you describe how race and the museum were invented concurrently or overlapping, parallel to each other? How do those two inventions bear any relationship to each other?
So every museum's going to have its origin story, and they're all different. And I'm not going to rattle on about all the different ways museums were made. I really like an essay by Subhadra Das and Miranda Lowe, where they kind of talk about natural history museums, which is quite interesting because you wouldn't think about race when you're thinking about natural history museums. And they kind of talk about the way that race is kind of the way that museums kind of consolidated and kind of entrenched scientific racism. And so, you know, scientific racism, eugenics, these are all ideas that came out of the 19th century, and the kind of the idea of like what is a human essentially, and categories of human, and at that time there was this like obsession with like categories and like hierarchies, taxonomies, and stuff like that. And museums, that is their bread and butter. Where do things go? And in a sense, I think as colonialism happened, one of the key factors is this idea of there needed to be a justification for the trauma, the murder, the exploitation. There needed to be a justification for it. And racism emerged from that, right? Racist hierarchies emerged from that. And museums then as museums developed, collections developed, including the plundering that took place throughout colonialism, all of these things sort of happened at the same time to create a system of knowledge that museums still have today that present us with this history, present us with a history in which kinds of shows us, in a sense, the way that colonialism happened, and also at the same time shows us the way in which society is seen through the kind of Western mind, in a sense. We need to remember 1492 is like the key date here, that Indigenous people, their meeting of colonizers, that was the beginning of our own knowledge about the West. And it's really important to kind of remember that even as we are discussing this, we are still doing it from this kind of Western European framing, if that makes sense. And it's really difficult to remember that actually our encounter with it, our people's encounter with it, that storyline is going to be very, very different. We're constantly, museums kind of, I think, have this really interesting way of thinking about who is the active protagonist of history, who is the passive victim, or who is the rescuer. All of these things about the story of history, the way it's framed. That's what a museum gives us, a kind of way of thinking about history and reality, which puts a particular type of person as the actor, a particular type of person as the victim. And that is a huge part, I think, actually, of decolonizing in a strange kind of way, because when you start to consider history in a slightly different way and you place another person as the victim or another person as the aggressor, suddenly world history looks very, very different.
My earlier conversation with Dan Hicks, he really seemed to have a lot of faith in the idea of world culture museums, like a framing where British museums could still kind of like hold on to these objects, and like there was a valid case for objects from other places to be here in the UK and on display, the context around them changing, or like the framing of them changing. But like ultimately there is a role for, beyond just like Saxon burial hoards and like Celtic knives. There's a case for objects beyond this tiny island being here.
One of the things that I feel is like very powerful about museums, and particularly restitution debates, this idea that there's something stolen in the museum, I think is such a powerful image, and it's such a powerful symbol for people, just everyday people. The idea that something was stolen and it's in the museum is like a hugely powerful thing. And so that idea of like we're holding on to this thing and we're looking after it, and it's like, well, no, you stole that thing and you need to return it. That, I think, is sort of, it concretizes, it makes something that is very quite abstract, because I think people don't have an education about colonialism, right? So that idea of like something is stolen in the museum kind of solidifies something that is real about our experiences, about like the ways in which maybe our families were stolen, the way that maybe our own heritages have been taken away from us, or like, why are we here? Because of these colonial legacies. And so I think that stolen object thing is actually very important. And so when you say like world culture museum, I think something about that troubles me somewhat, because in my mind it's like, well, firstly, in a way, all museums, all kind of, like, I should say, like big museums in the UK are kind of world culture museums, but why are they that way? And so it's sort of like a strange thing, because it's all about like the conditions of possibility, if that makes sense. It's like I'm sort of struggling with it a little bit, because, and also it's premised on this idea of education, and I think so much like really strange things happen under the guise of we're teaching people about different worlds. But that, in a way, it's like, but in what way are you teaching people about those other cultures, and like how is that coming across, and are the people who are learning about those things, do they understand our relationship, Britain's relationship with that country, if that makes sense? The historical relationship, which was a deeply unequal one. So I kind of feel a bit mixed about that, is what I'd say.
What is the link between decolonial thinking and restitution? Like, how does decolonial thinking in or around institutions affect the chances or possibility of restitution?
So restitution, the idea that an object should return to its place of origin. The idea of decolonizing, again, it comes back to this idea of we're challenging colonialism. That object, it has been stolen. That's a very material reality. So if that object is then returned, that is a material, valuable thing for that community. And so I don't want to, again, I don't want to make it into a metaphor. I don't want to make it into a symbol, but I just want to rest on that idea that that's a very powerful thing to have happened, I think. On the other hand, I do want to make it into a symbol a little bit, because I often say, and I often think to myself, that the stolen object in the museum, it kind of, I think it represents something, because it's saying like what has been stolen from us, right? It's there is a particular thing that colonialism took from us, and it's the ability to live with each other without that particular process having happened, right? Potentially without racism, right? We would metabolize a difference in a completely different way. Again, like, who knows? So it stole something else from us, right? It stole our ability to live together differently. And in certain communities, it stole people's whole lives. Like, think about people who are the descendants of enslaved people, for instance. It stole something. It's all about a kind of a deeper type of theft that goes on unacknowledged. And so whenever we talk about restitution, my mind always goes into that direction, into thinking about what else did you steal? What else did you steal? But so I think that, but then at the same time, I want to stick to the idea that restitution to me also symbolizes a very material reality of an object that you shouldn't have, and therefore returning it and believing that that community can take better care of it than you. Those types of things, I think, is important. It also makes me think of reparations. So, and the idea that the idea this country must provide reparations to countries that it colonized. Will it do that? No, but it should, right? So it sort of enacts this not enoughness. And maybe that's important, that it's not enough. Even if you return this object, that's not enough. And I think that's very productive, because like, it's never enough, right? It's never going to be enough. And I think that, again, it's in a strange way, this is the way that I am articulating my hope. There's something very important about saying, and that is not enough. What you took from us is never going to come back. There is a kind of, I guess the academic word would be a kind of affect happening there, where it's like there is a kind of grieving or mourning that may never end for what happened. And I think that idea that you return the object and therefore, okay, now we can draw a line under it, that's not what's going to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It makes sense of my question, but it also makes sense of this feeling I've been sitting with for like past year, a while, of like, I don't know, Mark Fisher, the hauntological, and is it Akil Mbembe, the necropolitical?
Yeah.
I'm trying to square this circle between those two, and I don't know how they interact yet, but I think your answer, I might listen back to it and be like, oh, there's something there to like join the gap.
Unpick.
Yeah.
I feel you. Yeah.
So there you go. That was my conversation with Dan Hicks and Samaya Kasim. Thank you to both of them, and thank you to Mubi for sponsoring this episode and this research and investigation. Hopefully you have learned something. Hopefully this has been interesting and it's given you food for thought. If you do want to watch Dahomey, then you can do so on Mubi from today, 13th of December. It is out now. If you already have a subscription, it's on there. Off you go. And if you don't, then you can head to mubi.com/thewhitepube, where you will get 30 days for free. And you can watch Dahomey, but you could also watch La Chimera with Josh O'Connor. You can watch In Camera by Nakash Khalid. You can watch The Substance. I will watch this. Everyone else in the entire world has watched The Substance except me. I'll be watching The Substance. And a bunch of other films. We love Mubi, unironically, uncynically. Match made in heaven. There you go. If you do end up watching Dahomey and or if you want to watch The Homie and you want a guide rope around the film in the form of my opinion, then stay tuned for this Sunday, 15th of December, when I'll be publishing my review. But that is it. I will leave you with that. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Samaya. Thank you, Mubi. And thank you to you for listening. Goodbye.